as a mayor on that particular issue, and I'm happy to talk about how I would propose to do that. And income disparity, what we did is, by working with the Black community, identified that one of the top barriers that we had, frankly, it was across a number of, we not only saw the disparities around income levels in the Black community, we saw it across race. And one of the issues that came up there was we often had jobs that required a four-year degree that did not really require a four-year degree to do the job well. And we started to remove that barrier based on feedback from the Black community that said, I have the skills, I have the experience to do that job, and we got our employers to remove those barriers. Another issue I worked on that the Black community directly contributed to was the barrier of our kids being able to access college and not come out with huge debt. It took 2 tries at the chamber, but we passed Prosperity Denver Fund that allows every Denver public school graduate to be able to go to post-secondary education and receive the assistance and support, so they don't have the debt, but they also don't have the barrier of paying for it. And I think there's additional barriers we're continuing to look at removing there to ensure we're fully utilizing those funds and our kids are getting access to them.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, yeah, 2 minutes, my bad.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, it's going to be very hard in 2 minutes to do all the things we've worked on together over the last 20 years, so I'll try to talk as fast as possible. I'll maybe do it in 3 categories. One is on youth, one is on workforce, and one is on wealth building. I think on youth programming, we've done a number of things in partnership. Obviously, you all were key partners for us on the effort to bring universal preschool statewide in 2020 when we did that for every child across the state. Key partners around the idea of when we tried to expand after-school and summer school programming citywide, particularly for kids on free and reduced lunch who didn't have access to that, which we know disproportionately affected our kids of color. That was critically important. We've grown that, want to grow it citywide in the mayor's office. I think when we look at workforce, we worked together both on multiple anti-discrimination pieces of legislation in the Senate to make sure that people weren't being discriminated against in the workforce, as well as some of the police reform legislation that I mentioned earlier that Senator Fields and I worked on together, from banning the chokehold, which you were intimate partners on, as well as the CLEAR Act on accountability and transparency. And then in the last 3 years, really focusing on wealth building. What are we going to do to help make sure we can close the wealth gap that exists for Black families? And we built the historic first fund to do that. The Deerfield Fund focused on Black home ownership. It now has more than $12 million in that fund, has put more than 100 families into home ownership, and has built a model for the rest of the country and for us to expand here to make sure we can actually be deliberate about closing the wealth gap. And in addition, have really prioritized, when I was at the foundation, how we invest in and grow Black entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of color, how we're putting more venture capital funds and more direct funding of businesses that we know where it's hardest for Black entrepreneurs to access capital. And we want to make sure we correct for that. And that's why one of the things I'd said I'd do as mayor is actually be a force to make sure the city dollars are actually moving much more quickly
Mike,
and more aggressively to communities of color.
Does that also answer the part about the collaboration? That's how you plan to continue to collaborate with everything you said?
Great. So for me, it is about that pattern is what I would want to do going forward, which is every big idea, we come to you first, sit down, say, what do you think the opportunity is? How should we make it better? And we would be co-authors of it moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me ask the second question I have. We'll start with you, Mike, and then Kelly will have you go second. Thank you. The second question, some of it already has been addressed a little bit, but I want to ask specifically to spotlight on it. What are you planning to do to correct disparities in the minority communities in a holistic approach, example, financially, socially, medically, and mentally?
Okay. So I'll focus first on financially.
And again, correct disparities.
Yes.
Just so there's more equality.
Yep. Yeah. So particularly, how do we focus on disparities that are financial? And I think this is why I mentioned, we know there are 2 big disparities. One is about wealth and access to wealth, and the other is about income. And so I think we want to focus on both, and particularly closing disparities. The Deerfield Fund was focused on home ownership as a way to close that wealth gap, and was specifically a race-based fund to work on that inequality, where we knew families didn't have access to opportunity. I would want to do the same around small business support, around making sure we have strategic investment into small businesses, particularly businesses led and founded by people of color, who we know already have a hard time getting access to capital from banks or from outside investors. I would want the city to not only be a lead investor in those businesses, I would want the city to be the convener, to bring together other private sector investors to say, we're invested in these businesses, we believe in these entrepreneurs, you should do the same. So we're not just putting our own city dollars in, we're attracting other private sector dollars to come on supporting businesses that are led by people of color to make sure that they grow. So I think home ownership is going to be a key strategy. We want to expand that citywide. I think that small business investment is going to be a key strategy. And I think also you talked about educational gaps as well. I think that's one of the reasons why we want to focus on providing high-quality after-school and summer school programming that addresses that 70% of learning time that kids have outside of the school day. And we know right now their access to those experiences are completely unequal because they're only based on how much your parents can pay to put you in a program, not based on what the core services the school provides. So that would be a little bit about education, about wealth building, and about small business development. Happy to address more of them when I have more time if you want me to.
This is a big one, and small amount of time, so let me go fast. First, I'll focus on home ownership. We know today home ownership in our city is being removed, continued to be removed, particularly from our Black community. And historically, we created the disparities we find ourselves in. I don't think we can depend on the market to build the product that allows home ownership to begin again, and I've proposed to build that product myself throughout the city. Through a for-sale condo product that can be an entry level that often is the product that allows people to begin home ownership, begin that wealth building that we know this is how we build wealth in our nation. And I'll give you way more details than you'd ever want, but I'll do it later so I don't use my time now to share with you how we could do that. A second issue is small business. Not only will I do this as mayor, but I've already begun this. I've been meeting with small business, Black-owned business, to talk about some of the barriers to our MBE, WBE, not just for the city of Denver, but for the opportunity to have that designation and compete for contracts with CDOT, RTD, DPS, so we make it easier and we remove the barriers. There's clear opportunities here. I think we can expand our own contracting to ensure our communities of color are getting access to these incredible opportunities and supporting them to ensure the success when they do get that contract and that opportunity. I'm also, you mentioned health disparities. This is such a huge issue. I think where the mayor has the greatest impact is not probably the health disparities when you get in the system, although we have to continue to work to advocate the work that needs to be done there in our healthcare system, but certainly access. I would continue to work, the city has an operating agreement with Denver Health, and I would continue to work on that operating agreement to ensure our communities are accessing the health care that they desperately can't get to today. And I think there's ways we could do that by putting more of those services in our schools so our kids can more easily access both mental and physical health supports, but also throughout our community. Today I have my health care through Denver Health. The places I've received that care have been throughout our city, and I have to say, I don't think we've acknowledged the quality of care that's occurring there and how important it is that we make sure more of our communities are accessing it.
Thank you, Kelly.
Excellent. We'll start with just a quick clarifying question with you, Kelly, that came to the light. When Mike was giving his opening statement, he indicated that his values were shaped by faith. We didn't hear that. Your statement was that your values were shaped by your experiences. Can you speak to how the role that faith plays, if any, in your life? And then, Mike, you're welcome to respond once we get clarity from Kelly.
Yeah, I certainly can. I've been raised Catholic. And I would say it was my faith community that helped my family navigate some of the greatest challenges that I described to you in my life, and critically important. But there was a second opportunity in my life where I feel my faith grew, and that was in my relationship with my husband, who's Indigenous. And I was exposed to new ways to think about how you grow your faith, and I felt mine only expanded in that relationship and that understanding.
Excellent. Thank you. Mike, any response to that?
I'm thinking a lot of great stories of my childhood, but my dad ran an ecumenical religious conference each year that was full of faith leaders from all around the country that he would convene. And so I always remember when I was a kid, if you got hurt playing sports, the plan was always we were going to pray on it. You'd lay hands on it. And sometimes it worked. It didn't work all the time getting you ready for the next game, but we kind of did a combination of those. But I think more than that, My parents had a faith that was really about their sense of service and their sense of works. I remember some of my first experiences in Denver were coming to the Catholic Charities downtown, to the food bank when I was 8 or 9 or 10, or to be able to work at that point in shelters. And they had a real sense of the real measure of what you give to the world is how you leave it better than when you found it. And for me, that's been the most important lesson of all, is how do you make sure that that calling is about the impact you can make for those who need support.
Excellent. Thank you. Next question. We'll stick with you, Mike. How should Denver change its approach in addressing the homelessness issue?
So for me, this is about, and this is where I think also the compassion of faith is a central theme, which is these are folks that are never planned for their lives to end up the way that they've ended up now. They didn't at age 10 say, this is where I want to be. There have been incredible combinations of trauma and challenge and loss that have put them in the moment where they are, and we have to approach that with, I think, the same compassion. So my belief is what we ought to be able to do is, one, provide people access to housing. We know that's the major problem we're facing, is the reason why a camping ban doesn't work. If you tell someone they can't camp on that street and you move them, and they have no place else to go, they just end up on the next street. And so my belief is what we should do is build housing that is dignified and stable and safe, and that we can build quickly and affordably. We don't have a long time to wait. And so that's why I've supported the idea of micro communities, where we take half-acre lots around the city that the city owns or other partners own, and we can put 40 or 50 tiny homes on that site where people can then move to that location, get access to safe housing, and you can have the wraparound services on that site people need. You can have mental health support, you can have addiction treatment, you can have workforce training, you can be able to make sure they get long-term housing support, and they have a sense of community still. We also know that when you protect that sense of community, when you move people, they're much more likely to succeed. So that means you can take 2 or 3 encampments and rehouse them all in a place where they have that sense of connection, and we know that works. We've seen it work all over the city, we've seen it work all over the country, and it offers people the dignity to get back on their feet and get back out into the world. And so that's what I would do as mayor, and I think this is not about criminalizing homelessness, it's about making sure we see people's needs for what they are and then provide the right services they need to get back up on their feet and back to being the best versions of what they wanted to be.
Excellent. Thank you. Kelly.
My plan around people who are unhoused in our city is based on the same compassion and commitment to ensure we save lives. So for me, I look at, in 2021, 269 people died because they're unhoused in our region. Last year, 173 people died. I think there's an urgency to get people to safer locations, and for us to provide the supports and services they need. And so my plan is that we end the unsanctioned camping and sanction temporarily locations where we can provide supports and services, where we can ensure running water and bathrooms and get food to people, but frankly also get people indoors in a crisis situation so we don't lose them. At the same time, I would be building with the region the housing and shelter we need to get people indoors or rehoused as quickly as possible. And I would focus on prevention. Keeping people housed is much more humane and way more effective than what we're doing today. And it's clear around the nation, a number of cities who have focused on keeping someone housed are having much more success and reducing trauma for people instead of adding to it. And so you would also see me move dollars to focus on prevention to keep people housed.
Excellent. Thank you. A quick question that really transitions into this really well from that question surrounding, as you worded it, those that are unhoused or homeless. If the Colorado legislature was to lift a ban on local rent control, do you support the city of Denver pursuing some form of rent control?
Yeah, I think what I'm proposing is not rent control, but mostly because when you look around the nation at rent control, it hasn't worked effectively, and I think there's a few reasons why. One, when you implement it, you see immediately the supply being built of housing go down. And we know a key strategy to making housing more affordable is to actually increase supply. So it has a negative impact. The second issue is those units that are rent controlled, if you're lucky enough to get one, it can work for your family. But when you're not, other units go up higher faster, which I worry about its impact on our community to be even worse for families who don't get the rent-controlled unit. The third issue is when you get a rent-controlled unit, even after your children are grown, often you stay in that unit to try to be able to afford and yet it takes a unit for families out of our market. Instead, what I would do is, one example would be issue an RFP as the mayor that says I would like to lease 3,000 units for 3 years, and I start to buy down the price of rent, lock it in, so that we could pass that savings on to our residents. But there's a second benefit. I'm now a co-signer on that lease, so before anybody gets evicted, then the city gets the chance to say, we'll cover their rent, keep them housed. This is part of the prevention strategy. And you start to see the connection then between affordable rental products and preventing people from losing or becoming unhoused. So that's the approach I would take.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike.
I completely understand the frustration that is leading to the call for this. I think the guy that ran for mayor of New York on the simple platform of the rent is too darn high, I'll say, in here, because we're in the house of the Lord. Probably would have done very well in this race because people are super frustrated and they're worried every month that the rent's going to get jacked up one more time and they're not going to be able to make it and they're going to be unhoused. And so I think that is a very real fear. I do think we have a better way to go about it, which is what I would propose as mayor, is I would build units that are permanently affordable with funding that we use from Proposition 123 and others. What that means is it offers the very protection people are worried about. If you're a first-year teacher and you make $40,000 a year, under in these units, your rent can never go above 30% of whatever you make. So if you make $40,000 a year, that means your rent is capped at $1,000 a month. And the law requires that rent can't go up unless your income goes up. So if you're a teacher or you're a nurse working on a set salary, you're not worried that every month you might get your rent jacked up. That can't happen. And it's deed restricted forever. So it doesn't matter if some landlord comes and buys the building next year, they can't come and jack up rents. If some new investor comes in, they can't jack up rents. So I think there is a way for us to deliver this kind of safety and protection for people to not have to have rents increased all the time, but I think to do it in a better and more effective way.
Good morning. I do apologize that I missed the introductions. I am Pastor Topaz McBride, and I am the Vice President of Social Justice, and thank you all for being with us this morning. My first question is a 3-part question, and the first part of that question is to ask how you will address white nationalism and the resurgence of hate crimes in the United States as it relates specifically to Denver.
Do you want us to just do one part at a time, or are you going to tell us all 3?
No, I'm going to do one part at a time because I don't want you to jump ahead.
Great. I will call it out everywhere and anywhere that it exists. I think one of the things that I've found historically is often white people are uncomfortable talking about race and talking about the importance of race and talking about the impact of race. One of the things I've learned in my journey is how to be honest about naming that and how important it is often as a white person to be able to be the first to name it and to say, this is unacceptable, we reject it, we refuse to allow it to grow in this city or in this state, and we are very clear on our values of inclusion, and this will, if I am the mayor, remain a city that is always inclusive, always welcoming, and always insists on a level of civility and trust and respect that doesn't allow for hate like that to foster.
Thank you.
I would absolutely do the same of calling it out, but I would also partner with organizations to make our voices even louder. I think about the Anti-Defamation League, the work they do. I think about the faith community, so that we're aligning on the power of that message to create the culture that says not only does the mayor think what's happening is wrong, but we as a community stand together in that position. And so I would use it as an opportunity to work with the Alliance and throughout our city to even identify additional voices that people might not expect to stand up and speak loudly against hate.
Based on both of your responses, it would suggest that you do have a level of sensitivity as it relates to the racism and the impact. So with that said, part 2 of this question, or part B, however you want to look at it, then how do you see from your perspective the fact that we have gone beyond a decade now of having a black mayor over this city, and now we are now moving to a white mayor that will be one of you, obviously. And so with that, how will you then respond to the Black community with regard to the level of impact that now living under a white mayor is going to have on our community?
Yeah, we have had, I think when I think of Mayor Webb and certainly Mayor Hancock, I would argue some of the probably best leadership in the nation. I'm honored to have Mayor Webb's endorsement and former Representative Wilma Webb's endorsement. For me, I think part of this has to be, and I've publicly tried to acknowledge this my entire life, that is the privilege I bring as a white woman. And not only talking with you in forums like this, but helping our entire city understand that privilege so that when we are trying to gain trust and relationship, we're also coming on an even playing field to do just that work. So I would continue to form and expand relationships in the Black community to create space where the feedback when I'm getting something wrong, you feel free to tell me directly and publicly. But also, more importantly, I think the opportunity to get it right. So this would be, you would see in my administration, people of color, leaders in key roles throughout the administration that come from the Black community. You will see advisors and stakeholder groups from the Black community advising the work and priorities of what we need to do. You would see me in community, working together to address the challenges and issues. You would see a budget that reflects the priority of race in our budget. And I'm done. I've been nixed.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think for me, the most important thing first is listening, right? Is being able to be close to the community and listening to the voices of those that have concerns and frustrations. And I think for this, you don't have to guess what I would do. You know what I have done, which is when I was elected to the state senate in Northeast Denver, I was also the first white person, I think, to hold that seat in maybe 50 years. And so I responded by making sure I was the closest to Black community and Black community leaders that I could to be able to learn from them, be able to understand their concerns and represent them as strongly as I could. And that means speaking out on issues of race when they're relevant. You may remember when you're speaking of white nationalism, when the Mother Emanuel shooting happened in South Carolina, and that was the night that I drove over to Pastor Tyler's church at AME and left a long note on his door saying that I would be a voice to make sure we would stand up against this kind of hate right here in our own communities, and we were grateful and thankful that there were community leaders and community churches like that standing up in the moment of hate. And so I think it is about listening, it is about being present, and it is about being in partnership. And I think that's what I've done over the last decade and what I would do as mayor, as making sure that your voices are present not just as faith leaders, because we need that voice on its own, but your voices are present as representatives of the Black community who have their very own powerful set of interests and needs and concerns that have to be front and center with the mayor. So I think those would be critically important. I did also talk to Mayor Hancock about whether it's possible for me to get an honorary membership in the Council of African American Mayors, but I don't know if that will turn out to be true or not.
Part C of this question is just to go a little bit deeper. Do you recognize then the link between what's happening on a national level with regard to the racism and how then the community of Denver, the Black community in particular, is going to respond now to white leadership? And what does that mean to you?
I think what we've seen nationally is what happens is when high-profile leaders, particularly high-profile white leaders, sanction racism, then that flares up all around the country. I think what you saw from President Trump was when you pushed more and more the boundaries of what leaders would say that were incendiary, that were racist, that were derogatory, that were inflammatory, it gave rise for all these folks who had either been in hiding for many years or who had known that that type of language wasn't welcome to suddenly come back up and to come back out and to feel emboldened and to march down our streets and to terrorize and to injure and to kill people and to feel like they had a viable place in the public debate. I think it's the obligation of leaders to do the opposite, which is to say we do have certain expectations of what's acceptable and what's tolerable and what inclusion means, and you have a heightened responsibility as a white leader in a diverse city to make sure you are clear and consistent and aggressive about that language, because if you don't, then we know what happens in the in the quietness that's untended, and that's what happened, I think, under President Trump, and we're still living in the aftermath of that. Or now it's going to take the reverse. It's going to take leaders to speak out forcefully and earlier and more often on the impact of race.
I do understand the challenge we face, and I understand why we face it. I think this is where I would rely on my values will guide me in terms of standing against whether it's hate or I often think another example would be what we all saw in Memphis just a few months ago, and the anger that it brings out when you watch what those officers did. For me, I think it's not enough to speak about it. I would ask your guidance as well of additional steps we have to take so that that anger and that voice isn't just yours, but those actions are not just yours either. And I also know this is where my privilege means I may not see as clearly what next steps we should be taking, and I would invite you to help me see them and ensure we're doing everything we can to address both the systems, which I think is the huge issue today, as well as individuals. But I think where we really need help is on the systemic. We have put so many systems in place that continue to perpetuate the racial inequities in our nation. That's where I would really invite your assistance so we could see those and start to break them down.
Thank you. So my last question then, in alignment with what I've already been asking. How is it different for the both of you when you are in an audience of privileged white citizens in Denver? How do you differ in terms of your voice and your position that is specific to what affects Black community? And are you comfortable in really taking the same stance as it relates to what you're presenting to us today, when your audience looks very different than what you are sitting in this morning?
Before you answer that, I'm going to have limited 1-minute responses, so we can move to our next.
Yes, sir. I not only am I committed to having the same response, I think if you look at every single forum we've been in, or frankly, throughout my entire life, my message doesn't change. My commitment to address the inequities. Listen, I ran a chamber of commerce where I said to them, just after we got best economy in the nation, we have serious racial and gender inequities still in our economy, and I need you to give me your money to invest in breaking those inequities down. My voice doesn't change. It stays exactly the same. I'm committed to addressing the racial inequities we still see in this economy and to do it in a meaningful, impactful way, no matter who the audience is.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, for me, it is the same purpose all the time in all the places. And actually, I would say the obligation to talk about it more directly is even higher in front of all white audiences because they have a different story about their own background and a different story about how privilege came to be. And those are the places you have to push harder. And that was the reason why when I opened our office in the Holly, and there were powerful white influencers who wanted to meet with me, they could come to the Holly. They could come to the neighborhood where we were serving the people that were fighting to get access to opportunity and have conversations there. That was why we wanted to start the Deerfield Fund, which is a fully race-based fund. I went to white banks and white boards to tell them why they needed to invest and to understand that these inequalities were not created by race-neutral policies. They were created by very racist policies. They're going to have to be undone by policies that are also not always going to be race neutral. You have to sometimes name the truth of what happened in order to be able to fix it. And I think oftentimes that is the place where your obligation as a white person in other communities of white people is the highest to tell that truth and make sure people hear it.
Thanks, Mike. From the audience, we have, and again, 1-minute responses to this one. It says the city will complete several $billion in construction related to projects over the next 8 to 10 years. How will you and your administration ensure that the workforce development will target young people of color to develop skills enabling them to participate in the workplace? Mike, we'll start with you.
Well, you asked earlier about what a partnership would look like, this is one of the critical places where you would be a great partner, where when we're looking at how we're going to let out contracts or recruit employees, we ought to go to those organizations that have the most connection to our community members who are looking for the chances to get hired. That means yes, nonprofit partners. That means yes, recruiting. That means yes, faith-based organizations. That means yes, political leaders. And it means prioritizing investing in those small businesses as they grow, so they have the capacity to be able to meet the size of those contracts. And so I'd be very focused. We found that in North Park Hill, which is a lot of the new businesses that came into that region never actually hired people from the neighborhood. Over and over we saw that, and we wouldn't even have notices that those organizations were hiring. So I think we need to use the relationships that we have in these communities, leadership of folks like Representative Herod and others who will be a voice in the community to understand and connect us to those services, and really rely on you all to be able to be partners to make sure the first time we know about those opportunities, they're out and available to every members of this network and others to make sure everyone can apply.
Thank you.
I've already talked with you a little about how I will do that for small business and supporting particularly businesses of color, but I want to focus on the youth portion of this question because my experience in high school was I wasn't exposed to all of the opportunities and options that were available to me. And so I entered the world with a very narrow view of what was possible. I think one of the key strategies here is that we make sure our kids in high school have the opportunity, and I would transition jobs in the city to be paid internships and apprenticeships for every single kid in Denver Public Schools, so they're exposed to different industries, different careers, but also the very contracting we're engaging in today, and they could start to see themselves in it and have the support to move in the direction. I really do believe this. If you can't see it, you can't be it. And I think our high school kids need to be able to have the exposure and opportunity to see the range of options and then the supports to get there.
Thank you. Have one last 1 minute response, if you would, and then I'll give over to Sharon Alexander Holt. I think this is to you, Mike. You stated that you took on the NRA and fought to bring about the gun package. Did you meet with the NRA? Who was at the meeting? Did you talk about grievances? And did you witness from Terrence Roberts? Excuse me, you trying to kind of read the writing. I can read reading, I just can't read writing. That's my. You rented a space there. It says also from Terrence Roberts. I don't know what. Amen. Well, anyway, you witnessed from Terrence Roberts, who rented your space, whatever that means. Do I need to read that again?
No, I'll do my best to answer.
Do it, okay.
So the first is, there have been a lot of efforts on gun safety over the last decade, and a lot of people working on it. There was a coalition that worked on this, was proud to work with Senator Fields, who led on this effort. And what we found was this. I did sit down and meet with the NRA. I sat down and met with other members of the coalition. I was one of the co-sponsors in the Senate, so was proud to support it there and help make the closing arguments on the Senate floor. But it was a broad coalition of leaders led by Senator Fields and John Morse and others who did great work on that legislation. But I think what we found was you have to take regular steps every single day to make increased gun safety. Universal background checks were really important. Banning high-capacity magazines were really important. Coming back to do red flag laws later was very important. The gun package that just got passed last week, historically important. And so those were conversations we had with broad coalition members. I was proud to be one part of it. But I also, I know what it's like to be in the middle of those fights when you have 100 NRA trucks circling the Capitol trying to intimidate you and giving you death threats, like I know others went through. But I think those are the moments where if you are going to make sure that you want to deliver safety for kids and communities, you stand up and do that. We see the impact of gun violence around our neighborhoods all the time, and we know the work is not done, but it means you got to have the courage to stay at it.
Thank you, Mike. Just a couple questions. They won't take long for you to answer, but again, that 1 minute category. First, how many black people have each of you hired? This is from the floor, from the community. How many black people have each of you hired in leadership positions? Kelly, we'll start with you.
I'm not sure I'll recall numerous. Do you want me to try to list some of the folks I've hired and engaged with? I can. I don't know how best to answer it. I'm happy to list. Tamika Montgomery ran the Small Business Development Center at the Chamber for me. We got best SBDC in the nation when I worked with Tamika. I've hired probably 10 people, black people, when I was at the chamber in a staff of 50, so 20%. When I was chief of staff to Hickenlooper, our team was very diverse. I want to recognize the mayor who makes those hiring decisions as chief of staff. I was primary in the partnership. One thing I can promise you, my entire life has been representative, probably more than representative, because I hire talent. And when you really look for talent, what you find is the diverse people of color are a key part. And I think there's been real barriers to people getting those opportunities. There would not be in my administration, and there hasn't been in my history. But I'm okay.
Thank you.
I'll just say quickly, I think every team I've led, I have left as far more diverse than when I got there. And I think at each of these cases, I've brought in key leaders and black leaders who helped design and build those programs. I'll go all the way back to when I was a school principal. My first hire was my assistant principal, Sue Lynn Toussaint, who ran that program with us. When we took over at Gary, our two of our top hires were Sharice Harris and Aisha Weeks, who now runs our Deerfield program, critical leaders who've been able to lead at that scale. And so I think at every stage of an organization I've run, I've had the chance to bring on senior leaders and leaders of color who then have grown into positions of even higher leadership. When I left at Gary, the leadership team was 75% people of color. When I arrived, it was 0% people of color. And so I've had a very explicit focus on making sure we develop talent. I started an organization called the Urban Leaders Fellowship, which was designed to recruit young, diverse leaders to come to cities like Denver and stay and make a long-term impact. We've now scaled that to 10 cities around the country where almost 1,000 fellows a summer come to be able to find their place as young leaders of color to take on work as either elected officials or nonprofit leaders or for-profit leaders. So that's been a big part of my mission.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it. One more quick question. This will be very quick. It won't take you a minute. We'll start with you, Mike. Do your children attend public or private school?
My kids attend both. I have kids in public schools and I have a student in private school.
Okay, thanks. You cover the bases. Kelly?
Public schools.
Okay, thank you.
Great. These are, again, questions from the audience and just 1 minute responses. First, how will you respond to the Park Hill Golf Course project redevelopment if elected mayor? We'll start with you, Kelly.
Yeah. I'm glad we're doing something non-controversial. This was an issue that I spent a great deal of time on. I'll try to go fast, though. I was a yes vote, but at the time, it took me a number of months to figure out what my position would be. I leaned toward a yes vote because of the housing affordability, I think, is a moral crisis in our city. This is half a mile from a light rail station, the food desert, and some other key issues. That said, I said at the time, if the residents of this city say no, I'll honor it and I'll do my best to buy that golf course. It's privately owned, and turn it into a park and honor what our residents have said. I announced that the day after we knew what the results of the election were. I think the response from the developer was she can't afford it and it's not for sale. And I told the reporter that's where negotiations always begin.
Thank you.
Yes, I supported it because when I was in North Park Hill, the two biggest concerns I would hear were, one, we don't have access to, we're in the middle of a food desert without access to a grocery store, and it is the last plurality black neighborhood in Denver that's being gentrified quickly, and there isn't access to affordable housing. Also said I would respect the will of the voters. When they voted no, we will now keep the easement in place and find a way to make that open space. But we also need to bring back the coalition around a common commitment to affordable housing, which is folks that said no also said they wanted to see affordable housing, just not in that location. We do want to see a park. We also know historically a park is the fastest way to gentrify a neighborhood. And so we need to make sure we're proactive about securing that land around that open space to make sure that land is going to stay affordable for people. Otherwise, you'll have the same set of developers coming to buy up those lands, that land, and build expensive units if we don't make those units affordable. So I think, yes, keep the easement in place. Yes, make sure it's open space. And yes, we should now be able to work collaboratively on getting affordable housing done around the region.
Excellent. Thank you. For this question, again, quick response, 1 minute, please, from the audience. I presume, based on the way this question is worded and looking at the recent article, it says you've recently been endorsed by the police. I'm presuming that's the Denver Police Protective Association, which means this will be addressed to you, Kelly. As mayor, how will you encourage improvement in relations between law enforcement and the communities they serve? And then Mike will give you an opportunity to respond.
Yeah, this is a critical issue. When I was deciding to run, one of the areas I focused on was public safety. How do you both hold police accountable, but also support them, which is, I think, the challenge before us throughout the United States, but I'll just focus on Denver. In that conversation, for me, it started in the process of going through the interviews. A few examples, I think, that will give you insight in what you could expect from me is, one, the position I've taken on the shooting last summer we saw in Lodo was the first example, I think, of how I would operate as your mayor. I agree with the grand jury in that decision, and I've been very clear about that ever since, that the 2 officers acted appropriately, 1 officer did not. And I think we need a mayor who's willing to take those positions and show that we're capable of discerning those issues. But I also believe this is where we have to work in community. We know today we have communities all over Denver who are still over-policed, whose kids are being pulled over constantly, and I think this is in partnership. We're capable of working in community and identifying what's the right way to serve and protect in that community without over-policing or causing undue the issues on race that we're seeing today. And that's how I would operate as mayor, is working with you on what does that look like and how do we improve the safety in your community. And then the last piece is, so much of my platform around community safety has to do with prevention and moving toward a recognition that by providing recreational opportunities, stable housing, a good education, access to true economic opportunity, those are the things that communities need.
Thank you. Last question.
Can I
Oh,
respond?
okay. You want to respond? Okay.
Thanks. And to your earlier question of, do you have the same answer everyone that you speak to? My answer is, yeah. I met with the officers, and they wanted us to push to roll back all of the officer accountability that Representative Herod and others passed 3 years ago, including reinstating qualified immunity for officers. I would not commit to doing that. I don't think that's the right step. I think officers should be held accountable if they abuse people's civil rights. And I'm excited to work with them. We will figure out how to make a right partnership and restore a sense of real community-based partnership there. I'm also very proud to have the endorsement of the Denver Area Labor Federation, which represents 61,000 members and more than 114 unions all across the metro area that are supportive and excited to make sure we get a city back that serves working families, and so excited to get to work on that.
Last question to both of you. What are your priorities for maintaining, enhancing, and managing the city's financing? And that is, Denver is one of the highest tax rates, has one of the highest tax rates, which is 8.65%. Property tax is being increased. We want to know, how will you handle this as it relates to the budgeting and the financing of the city and county of Denver? 1 minute.
Great. And do we have a closing after this, or is this last question and closing all at once?
Yeah, you have 1 minute closing
Okay,
too,
great.
but we'll get to that.
So I'll be faster than 1 minute. I know you got folks waiting. My short answer is, I think I'm the only one who's come out and laid out on all the policies we've talked about today: housing, homelessness, public safety, a full comprehensive plan, and a full budget for how exactly each of these things are paid for and where exactly those dollars come from, and how to do that without increasing taxes. So I believe that the taxpayers of Denver have been very generous in providing services for us to be able to solve the problems we face. I think it's now incumbent upon the next mayor to use those resources to actually deliver results, and that's what I'm committed to do.
Yeah, I think we have a number of challenges, not just the tax rate, but the reality is, if you got your assessment for residential or commercial, our smallest businesses, we all fell out of our chairs in this last week. So you'll see in my budget, we're proposing actually an increase in the assistance we provide, particularly for seniors in our city, to make sure they don't lose their homes. Even without a tax increase, I think there's tremendous risk, and I think we need to provide more assistance based on need to keep people in their homes. Sales tax is another area that is a serious problem. This is a tax that disproportionately impacts when you're lower income. And we have one of the highest sales tax. About 45% of Denver's general fund today is dependent on that sales tax. I think we have to begin to continue to explore how our tax policy is hurting the poorest people in our city. And I continue to believe it is, and I think we have to look at Tabor, which is what drives that sales tax, and reconsider why it's not working for the hardest working families in our city. And if I may just say, I have never promised anything. It did not even come up in my interview with police that there'd be any changes to state law or issues around holding them accountable when they're violating people's constitutional rights or they're violating the law.
Before your closing remarks, we do want to acknowledge our city fathers, to you, Dr. Asen Phillips, and Dr. James Peters is here also. And I'll give you 2-minute statements. Bishop, can you do that for us? And all right. And also to Dr. Peters, and we certainly want to honor things that you've done, but we have another 2 sessions we have to go to, so we want to at least acknowledge you with a 2-minute remark.
Thank you. I'm Reverend James Peters, and I'm happy to admit that for the last 3 elections I supported Michael Hancock. I say that because when you're running for mayor, don't spend all of your time talking about what the former mayor did. Tell us what you are going to do, because that's the honest way to deal with that. Secondly, I appreciate the fact that there have been a lot of candidates, and we had a lot of them, for this election. And I hope when it's done, we'll see that we all worked hard and tried to get the best candidates. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here today to share with you. I'm concerned that we're making a real transition in terms of understanding. And I heard you, Mike, talking about what you did as a senator. And I don't know whether you understood that we didn't have but one black senator. And you took that slot and occupied it for 2 terms, which meant we had nobody at the table. You have done a lot of things working together in the community. Sometimes I wonder if you always understand clearly how to do. Some of the things you're proposing sound great. The real question is, will you do it? And can we count on it? Or is it just verbiage? And when we get through with it, we'll be right where we were before. And Kelly, I'm concerned about whether or not you're clear about who is the black community and who you need to deal with and how to relate to it. You've been in a second position role a lot of time. You're going to be in a head role now. And this community has thrived across this nation. Denver, Colorado is almost one of the pivotal points for what happens across the nation, and what goes on in Denver affects what goes on around this nation. We have a collaboration in the black community every Thursday with 41 major cities that are all talking about what happens. Everybody's looking at Denver because of what we've been able to do. With an 8% black population, we will have 24 years of mayor's leadership. Those black men who led didn't lead just black folk, they led the whole community. And there was always an inclusiveness. And I'm concerned about how you all are going to connect back with us. And what Dr. Peters was saying, it's not what happened yesterday. I don't care how much yesterday you enjoyed it, you can't eat yesterday's lunch. You got to have a new meal for the day. And it's depending on what you're really going to do. And do we have to chase you after this election is over to catch up with you to find out what you're going to do for black folk? We need to have some direct connections to make sure this city stays. This is the only major city in this nation that didn't burn up in the 60s. And it didn't burn up because of the collaboration of black and whites working together. One of my themes is always, it takes the black and white keys. If you're going to play the Star Spangled Banner or sing Amazing Grace. What we were able to do in leadership, I don't want to see go backwards and come back now. We have to start all over again, rebuilding what we already have. We have one of the greatest opportunities. You have more tax money, you know what to do with. You're taxing marijuana, and it's supposed to go to education, and yet we can't fix the schools. I'm concerned that you do what you say you're going to do, and we don't have to run fines you when the election is over.
Thank you, Dr. Peters and Dr. Phillips. We want to now have our closing remarks. We'll start with you, Kelly, and we'll end with Michael. That'll end our session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for those words. I want to change what I want to close with because I think it is critically important that you feel more confident about how I would lead as your mayor. And you could expect to see what you see in my campaign or in my history, and that is I not only won't diminish past mayors, I invite their support. And I'm honored to have Mayor Webb's and Representative Wilma Webb's endorsement. But even more to me is I won't diminish other people because in this campaign I will not diminish anyone, even when they disagree with me, and we disagree strongly sometimes, because my job is to bring our city together, to find a path forward, to address the issues. And the only way I can do that work is with your help, both in terms of understanding the challenge and the issue before us, but also in identifying the path forward, the solutions. And so you can expect to see from me an administration with people of color throughout it in key roles, directing and advising me. You can expect me to see me in community, inviting your feedback, both complaints and praise, and I can take both. But maybe most importantly, you can see me recognizing my dependence on you to make progress and achieve success. We will only do this work together, and I'm committed to doing it that way, and I would love to have your support in getting there and address some of the challenges we face, but also deliver on the hope that we all see for our city.
Thank you all so much for having us, and thank you, Bishop Phillips, for your great point about it matters what you deliver. And I think in those cases, your record matters. And I would attest that I have been good for my word on things that I've committed to do, and I will be good for them again going forward, in both being present and being in relationship, and in having the courage to make hard decisions and to pull people together. I was thinking actually of probably 10 years ago, many of you probably remember this, I was in the Holly the night that Selena Hollis was murdered. If you remember, she was killed at the Jazz in the Park, and we had an officer from District 2, from our community. And at that moment, there was still a lot of conflict in the neighborhood between officers and between community members who felt like they were feeling over-policed, and it had been a contentious time. And that morning we got up and said, what are we going to do to try to bring this community back together today? And before all the rest of the officers on Selena Hollis' shift came back, all the community members rallied to bring an entire potluck to the District 2 office and to be lining the front doors of the entrance when all those officers came back. And some of the folks who were the strongest critics of those officers were the first ones there to give them a hug and welcome them back into the department and say thank you for your service. And let's find a way forward together, even if we don't always agree. I think that's the kind of community you can build when you're present and you listen and you're engaged and you know that there is a lot more we can get done if we're partnering together. That's what I've had the privilege to do with you in the past, and that's what I hope I have the honor to do with you in the future.
I want to thank both of you for coming. We'll have remarks from our president, but we will be sending you the unanswered questions from the floor. And if you'd like to, certainly we'd like for you to answer those and get those back to us. Let's give God a hand praise for Mr. Johnston and Miss Kelly Brough. And we're going to have words from our president. Then we will break for 5 minutes. Then we'll have city council candidates for District 9, Candi CDebaca and Darrell Watson. We'll be interviewing them, and that's in 5 minutes. Mr. President.
Thank you so much once again for being here. We appreciate your candid answers. And to our city fathers, Bishop Phillips and Pastor Peters, thank you so much for being here. We respect and honor those words. And I don't know if we could find any words stronger in wisdom than what you shared, Bishop Phillips. I appreciate that. And I hope that these two candidates hear us and not just listen, but actually hear what we're saying. And we're speaking from our hearts. We're speaking from our hearts. Our community is the dearest thing to us. We feel like our ministry begins once we walk outside those four walls. We go to church to worship and praise, but after we're done, we start ministry. And to us, this is a ministry, our connection with you. So that being said, thank you all for coming. Remember, it is being recorded. And Pastor Whitmore, would you tell them again where they can find? Say that again.
God's Word TV, the number 2.
Praise God. Thankful for everyone that's here. I think I've seen Big T here. Well, thank you. Another former president of the Alliance. Thank you so much for being here, sharing with us. And, of course, Reggie sent in his questions, so we recognize all those leaders that contributed today. We're going to have about a 5-minute break.